Hello, business finance students. We want to discuss this week about two chapters, which are chapters 5 and chapter 6. We'll start with chapter 5 first, and this is about Federal Reserve and what is Federal Reserve? What do we know? And what is their job of Federal Reserve? And as you all know, sometimes, for example, you all know you want to buy a house. And suddenly you see these days, if you want to buy a house, you have to pay 7% interest, usually. That's what the interest rates are these days, which are considered little high for, a mortgage. And that's for housing, for houses. Of course, credit cards are much more. And who decides these interest rates? Who said that the credit card interest rate is supposed to be 25%? What organizations would impact? What can happen that these rates to go up or down? And therefore, one of the main organizations that has a lot to do in dealing with interest rates is Federal Reserve. It deals with economics. They say that there are three very important jobs in Washington, D.C. in terms of economics and finances. One of them is the chairman of Federal Reserve, and another one is the Treasury Secretary. Another one is a position at the White House, which is known as chairman of the Economic Council. Therefore, now the focus of today is about Federal Reserve. What is the job of Federal Reserve? The purpose is to control the supply of money and credit. Supply of money means that how much money we have in the hands of the people. Of course, if I ask you how much money you have, your answer would be, I have one. You might say, I have $1,000 in the bank. That's correct. That's the money you have in the bank. Can Federal Reserve to do something? Can Federal Reserve get involved in encouraging you to take that money away from you? And in a legal way, in a smart way, yes. Imagine that if Federal Reserve comes and tells you that if you give me your $1,000, I am going to give you an interest of 30% a year. Of course, you will give your money, when you give $1,000 to the Federal Reserve, and they might pay you 30%, interest. That's a good deal. Therefore, what does it mean? It means that the Federal Reserve, suppose one of the things it does is that through the Treasury, they discuss about selling, bonds. When they sell bonds, that means you are borrowing from the Federal Reserve. Of course, 30% is a very high interest rate. Therefore, it tries, the goal of the Federal Reserve is to use monetary policy to promote stable prices. Stable prices means that they want to get the inflation under control. You don't want to go to Walmart and suddenly see that the prices of milk and oranges have tripled or quadrupled. Why? Who can monitor these things? That's the Federal Reserve. How does it monitor? We will talk about it. Another goal of Federal Reserve is to make sure that the people have jobs, because if things go wrong, therefore the people will lose their jobs. Therefore, the Federal Reserve, through the monetary policy, its monetary policy, it tries its best to make sure everybody has a job. How can everybody have a job? Is to make sure that these companies have enough money in their hands, they can be profitable, they can continue their business, and there is enough money for them to borrow. That way they can, continue their operation. That way they can hire the people. Because if the economy goes bad, they start, firing the employees. And therefore, and also, another purpose of Federal Reserve is the economic growth. It wants to make sure that, you all have heard of gross domestic products, GDP. There are more products, there are more economic growth. That way, everybody can have a better standard of living. That means if you are driving an old car, the goal of the economy is that to make sure you can afford buying a better car, to make sure that you don't run out of money. That way you can pay your rent. If you have a house, to make sure that if you decide to go and improve and buy a better house, you can. Therefore, that is the goal of the money. The Federal Reserve, one of the goals of Federal Reserve, of course, the Federal Reserve is not the only organization that decides about it. There are others who decide about it as well. Let's say they think about the taxes. Maybe the taxes are not done through the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve usually deals with monetary policy. Monetary policy is that it decides how much money should be in the, maybe the Federal Reserve tells the Treasury, go and print the money, let the money, let's have the money in the hands of the people, Therefore, it can control the amount of money that, is in there. It has some tools to do that. We are going to talk about it. And we come here, a structure of Federal Reserve. It is just like a Congress that have members, 425, or we have maybe 100 senators. Federal Reserve also has three components, three groups of people. One is their, board of governors, and then imagine that we have 50 states, and out of 50 states, these states, some of them are bundled together. Therefore, I have divided, there are 12 district banks that they are, imagine that Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia, Washington, D.C., these are considered maybe one block. There are 12 maybe of these blocks across the U.S. to make sure that this is just like a consortium. And maybe they have one president, all of these states might have, get together. And because these banks are supposed to have representatives. For that reason, maybe, they choose every, organization, banks come together and suddenly to make sure they have one representative. That way they can talk to the federal government to tell them what the problems are, to the Federal Reserve. There is another committee that they call it Federal Open Market Committee. And now I put this in Microsoft Word to see how they are and who they are. Board of Governors of Federal Reserve, as you see, has 7 members, just like the Supreme Court that they have 9 members. This Board of Governors has, a Board of Governors of Federal Reserve, or, they are in Washington, D.C., and these 7 members sit down and talk about, the monetary policy and other issues. Then we said that there are 12 regional banks. Each regional bank, each regional district has one president. Therefore, there are 12 presidents here. Regional branches of Federal Reserve that implement, supervise banks, and provide financial services. Therefore, we have 12 people here that these 12 people also advise these 7 board of these people who are on, at the head of the Federal Reserve. Then there is another committee that they call it Federal Open Market Committee. This one has 12 members. Who are these 12 members? And consists of 7 members of the Board of Governors. It means these 7 members in here are part of these 12 members. That means 5 more members we need to have. Those 5 more members, one of them is the district manager comes from the New York, because New York most likely is such an important state in terms of finances that one of these, that means 7 here, one of them is, we have 8 so far. There are 4 more members to make it this Federal Open Market Committee. Who are these 4 members? They go to this group and they rotate on a rotating basis. They choose, one person from, 4 of them. Therefore, that is to make sure that all the banks are represented. That way, they can make, strategic decisions to make sure that there is enough money in the banks for, to, continue, suppose lending money to institutions. Therefore, that is the way that the Federal Reserve is, has members, and therefore, and what does Federal Reserve? This is, I want to make sure, this is chapter 6. I want to make sure I am in chapter 5. Here is chapter 5, and I come here, and this chart shows the structure of Federal Reserve. The President of the United States chooses appoints the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. But one thing about the Federal Reserve is that you want to make sure this Federal Reserve is independent. By saying that is that you don't want them to be necessarily Republicans or Democrats, because if they are independent, they are not, thinking about the party. They are just thinking about what can they do to make sure the banks don't go bankrupt, the people have jobs, there is enough money, there is enough credit, the people don't owe a lot of money on their credit cards. Therefore, it is an independent, and then we talked about these groups, and we said that these 7 board members, are dealing with 12, regional banks, and the banks, are represented through these 12 regional banks, and then we have another one, which is called Federal Open Market Committee. 7 members of the board are here, and President of New York District Bank is there, and 4 more are here, and these are the people who think about the monetary policy. Monetary, as you know, comes from the money, how to handle the money. And we see reserves are percentage banks hold against deposit liabilities. This is a very important concept. Let's say you take $100, you go to the bank. Here we have, Berk and Herbert Bank, which before was Summit Bank, or you take your $100 bank money to let's say to Bank of America. Can the Bank of America, as soon as you deposit your $100 in that bank, another person goes to the bank and applies for a loan for $100? Should the bank give the $100 that you deposited in the bank to the person who is, applying for a loan for $100? The bank can do that because, as you all know, you go to bank and borrow money. That's where where does the bank get the money? The money is the ones that the people put in their, their account, in their checking account. They take money that, they're relying on the checking account that you have. They, lend the money to other people. But the question is that if you put $100 in the bank, and imagine that that is the only money that the bank has, and then another person comes and says needs $100, the issue would be if the bank gives that $100 away, you might go to the bank after it gives it away, you might go to the bank and say that you need to withdraw your money. And the bank doesn't have that $100 because it has given it to someone else. Therefore, Federal Reserve comes with the idea that comes with the bank that there has to be a reserve in every bank. By saying reserve, usually I think now the rate is 10%. The Federal Reserve says that if someone brings $100, brings it to the bank, go ahead and give 90% of it, lend it to other people, reserve 10% of it. Why does the Federal Reserve does? Because not everybody at once is going to go to the bank and tries to withdraw their money. Therefore, you always need to have some cushions, that cushion to have some money in the bank that you can, to make sure that if suddenly customers walk in, there is enough money. Therefore, the banks will, whatever money comes to the bank, imagine that today, $10 million came to the bank. What the bank does, bank is allowed to give, to loan, to lend $9 million of it. But $1 million of it, the Federal Reserve tells them that, hey, don't lend, all $10 million, just lend 90% of it. Keep 10%, as a reserve. That way you can operate that way to make sure there is availability of the money for the people who write their checks and everything. Therefore, with that, the Federal Reserve is the one that says what percentage. Because if things become bad and banks go bankrupt, Federal Reserve might say, oh, only give 20%, keep 20%, lend out, 80% of it. Therefore, that is one of the, responsibilities of Federal Reserve. And then transaction that take reverse out of the system will cause the supply of money to contract, which means, when someone, when the money gets out of the system, supply of the money becomes, less. And now, let's say you have some money and the Federal Reserve and the government wants, as I said, to get your money to make sure you are not putting your money in the bank. Can the federal government come up with some, scenarios to make sure to reduce the money that is in the bank? Why should the federal government, decides to reduce the money in the bank? Because if the money is in the bank, sometimes the bank, keeps, the banks like to, lend money, and suddenly the economy might be overheating. Overheating means that suddenly they end up producing a lot of cars. You have seen cars in the dealership. If they produce a lot of, let's say, car makers make a lot of cars, more than what the people can buy, therefore these cars are going to sit in the parking lots. Nobody is going to buy them because whoever who needed bought them. Then the problem is would be that factory might dismiss the employees. Do you see that? Factory workers, they can lose their jobs. That can be the problem of overheating the economy. Therefore, if suddenly there is too much money available, sometimes the Federal Reserve tries to find a way to, reduce the amount of money that is available. What it does is that one of the things it can do, for example, it can come and tell the banks that what we want you to do, we want you to keep 20% in the bank. Don't lend more than, 20%, more than 80%. Therefore, the bank, in that case, will give out less money. When it gives us less money, then that car manufacturer doesn't have enough money to, have more cars to, produce more cars, to build more cars. For that reason, the Federal Reserve tries to okay, I will send another video. For now, just this was the first lecture.